The morning he bought the land, the swamp was holding its breath. Fog lay low over the water, pale as milk, drifting between cypress trunks like something undecided. The insects had not yet begun their chorus. Even the birds seemed cautious, waiting. He stood at the edge of the property with the deed folded in his back pocket, boots sinking slightly into the soft ground, and listened to the quiet as if it might speak first. He was not a man anyone expected to see here. Not anymore. His name had once been attached to acreage with fences and cattle, to a house with a porch that faced west. That life had thinned slowly, then all at once. Drought took the grass. Debt took the herd. Silence took the marriage. By the time the auction signs went up, he had learned how to pack a life into a truck bed without ceremony. The swamp was what remained on the map when everything else had been crossed out. County records called it non-viable, flood-prone, unusable. The price reflected that judgment, a figure so low it felt less like a purchase and more like a dare. Friends told him it was a mistake if they spoke at all. Most just nodded the way people do when they believe you have already decided to disappear. He signed the papers in a windowless office that smelled of toner and old coffee, then drove until pavement gave way to dirt and dirt surrendered to mud. Now he stood there, hat in hand, looking at land no one wanted. Water pooled where grass should have been. Reeds bent under their own weight. Somewhere deeper in the swamp, something moved, then stopped. He told himself it was only wind, though the air was still. He had learned, over the years, how to accept explanations that required nothing further from him. He walked the perimeter slowly, measuring distance with his steps, marking boundaries in his head where survey stakes should have been. His boots were cracked at the seams, the leather softened by years of weather and work. Each step made a sound that vanished almost immediately, swallowed by damp earth. The place resisted permanence. It did not want to remember footprints. By late morning the fog began to lift, revealing water the color of tarnished silver and sky the faint blue of something bruised but healing. He sat on the tailgate of his truck and ate a sandwich he did not taste. Hunger had become a background noise, like the hum of insects that finally rose as the sun warmed the ground. He wiped his hands on his jeans and stared out again, trying to imagine what, if anything, could grow here. The truth was he had not come to build. Not yet. He had come because the land asked nothing of him. No neighbors to explain himself to. No fences to mend immediately. No history that knew his name. It felt honest in its refusal. He respected that. Some places, like some people, could not be improved by force. As the afternoon wore on, he noticed signs that complicated the emptiness. A line of flattened grass where none should have been. An impression in the mud too wide for deer, too deliberate to be chance. He crouched, touched the edge of it with 2 fingers, and felt the lingering coolness where water had not yet reclaimed the shape. His pulse quickened, then settled. The world was full of shapes that meant nothing if you let them. Still, he found himself listening more carefully. He heard water dripping from leaves, the distant knock of wood against wood, his own breathing steady and controlled. There was a smell beneath the rot, something warm and animal, faint but persistent. It reminded him of barns at dawn, of hay and sweat and patience. The memory arrived without warning and stayed longer than he expected. He told himself stories to pass the time. That he would clear a small patch and raise goats. That he would sell the land when prices rose if they ever did. That starting over did not have to mean starting big. Each thought felt provisional, like a bridge thrown across water without checking the depth. The swamp accepted them all without comment. Near evening, the light shifted, turning the water darker, the trees taller. Shadows lengthened, joining where they touched. He walked farther in than he had planned, drawn by nothing he could name. The ground grew firmer, then softer again. Mosquitoes found him. He waved them away absently, attention fixed ahead. That was when he heard it. Not loud. Not close. A low sound, carried unevenly through the reeds, rising and falling like breath pushed through a tired chest. He stopped mid-step. The sound came again, followed by another, overlapping deeper. It was not wind. It was not machinery. It had weight. It had intention. He stood very still as the swamp exhaled around him, and for the first time since he signed his name on that thin county line, he understood that the land had never been empty at all. He returned at first light, moving slower now as if the land might startle if approached too quickly. The fog was thinner, stretched like gauze between trees, and the air carried a sharp, living smell that clung to the back of his throat. He followed the sound he had heard the night before, guided less by certainty than by a feeling he recognized from long ago, when animals had depended on his attention to survive. The reeds parted before him, and the swamp revealed its secret without ceremony. Horses stood knee-deep in water and mud, their bodies angled defensively, heads high, eyes bright with caution. They were not the glossy animals painted on ranch signs or calendars. Their coats were dull, scarred in places, colors muted by grime and sun. Steam rose from their flanks as they breathed, steady and controlled, a rhythm older than the fences that had failed them. He stopped where he was. Instinct told him not to move closer, not yet. One horse stamped, sending a ripple across the water. Another turned slightly, placing itself between him and a smaller shape pressed tight against its side. The foal's legs trembled, thin as saplings, one hoof lifted awkwardly from the mud. The sight landed in him with quiet force, the way truths sometimes do when they arrive without argument. He lowered himself until his knees touched the wet ground. Cold seeped through denim. He felt it but did not flinch. His hands rested open on his thighs, palms empty. The horses watched every shift of weight, every breath. He understood that their stillness was not calm but calculation, a balance struck between flight and exhaustion. Time stretched. Insects resumed their hum. Somewhere overhead, a bird called once and fell silent. The horses did not advance, but they did not retreat either. The mare with the foal flicked an ear, then another. Mud slid slowly from her flank. The man realized he was holding his breath and let it go, carefully, as if sound itself might break the fragile agreement forming between them. He backed away first. Not far. Just enough to show he knew the rules. When he reached drier ground, he stopped and turned, leaving his back exposed longer than comfort advised. He did not look over his shoulder until the reeds swallowed the water again and the shapes within it blurred. Only then did he feel the tremor in his hands. He returned to his truck and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. His reflection in the cracked windshield looked older than he remembered, eyes darker, jaw set in a way that suggested resolve rather than anger. He had not planned for this. The land had not mentioned occupants in its paperwork. Yet the thought of calling anyone, of reporting what he had seen, tightened something in his chest. By afternoon he was back, carrying 2 battered buckets. He filled them from a shallow well he had marked earlier and hauled them toward the clearing, muscles protesting the unfamiliar strain. He poured the water slowly at the edge of the reeds and stepped away. When he returned the next day, the buckets were empty, tipped carefully on their sides. He brought hay after that. Not much. Enough to signal intention without presumption. He left it where the ground rose slightly, a place less likely to flood. Each visit followed the same pattern. He arrived quietly. He stayed at a distance. He left before dusk. The horses began to shift their positions when he appeared, no longer bunching tightly, no longer preparing to bolt at the first misstep. On the 4th day he noticed the limp had worsened. The foal lagged, struggling to keep pace as the others moved toward firmer ground. He felt the old calculation stir in him, the habit of weighing risk against necessity. Intervention could shatter what little trust existed. Doing nothing carried its own cost. He chose for now to wait, though the choice sat poorly with him. Word travels even through forgotten places. A man from a neighboring property stopped him at the road and asked what he planned to do about the horses. The tone was casual, the question less so. He shrugged, said he was still learning the land. The neighbor nodded, eyes narrowing slightly, and mentioned fines, regulations, trouble best avoided. The conversation ended without resolution, but the warning lingered. That evening, as the light thinned and the swamp darkened, he noticed something new at the edge of his property. A slender orange stake, driven deep into the mud, marked with a number he did not recognize. It stood straight and confident, an assertion made by someone who had never knelt in the water. He looked from the stake to the distant shapes of the horses, barely visible now, and understood that the fragile piece he had entered was already being measured by forces that did not care who was watching. He did not touch the stake. He circled it instead, slow and deliberate, memorizing its placement against the trees and the bend of the water. The horses shifted in the distance, unsettled by something they could not see but clearly felt. He sensed it too, a pressure like weather changing in his bones. This land, dismissed as worthless, was suddenly speaking a different language, one written in numbers and claims rather than tracks and breath. He realized then that finding the horses had not been an ending but an opening, and that whatever came next would demand more than quiet kindness. It would ask him to choose between staying invisible and standing where others would finally notice. He remained there until darkness finished its work, aware that the swamp was no longer only a refuge but a line already crossed. Somewhere beyond the trees, unseen engines idled, and plans were already moving toward him, patient and certain, the way powerful things wait when they believe time is on their side, alone in the dark. He slept poorly after the stake appeared, waking to every unfamiliar sound as if the swamp itself had learned his name. At dawn he walked the boundary again, following the thin line he imagined between what was his and what others believed they could take. The orange marker glowed against the muted greens, an intrusion impossible to ignore. He left it standing, though the urge to pull it free tugged at him with childish insistence. Within a week letters arrived. Envelopes heavier than they needed to be, stamped with authority and sealed with language that pretended to be neutral. They spoke of assessments, of environmental compliance, of necessary access. They did not mention horses. They did not need to. The implication pressed down just the same. He read each page twice, then stacked them neatly on the table as if order might soften their meaning. He began asking questions. At the county office, clerks answered with practiced vagueness, eyes flicking toward doors, voices dropping when names were mentioned. One woman slid a file across the counter and said nothing at all. Inside were maps that did not match the land he walked each day, wetlands erased with the clean confidence of a ruler. He felt a flicker of anger, unfamiliar and sharp, and wondered how long the erasure had been underway. The horses sensed the change before he did. They grew restless, shifting their grazing patterns, ears pricked toward distant noises he could not yet hear. One morning he found a length of wire near the waterline, new and bright, half hidden beneath grass. It had not been there the day before. He picked it up and felt its unnatural weight, the way it resisted bending. He carried it back to the truck and left it there, a quiet inventory of threats accumulating. He learned the corporation's name by accident, overheard in a diner where conversation traveled faster than food. A development firm with interests in water rights and mitigation credits, spoken of with admiration by those who had never met its representatives. The swamp, someone said, was sitting on a vein of value. He listened without comment, stirring his coffee until it went cold, understanding at last why worthless land had begun to attract attention. The first horse disappeared on a Tuesday. He noticed the absence immediately, a gap in the loose constellation he had come to recognize. The others stood closer together, heads low, their movements sharp with unease. He searched until dusk, calling softly, scanning the reeds for any sign. There was nothing. No tracks. No blood. Only the impression of removal, clean and efficient. The foal cried once, a thin sound that cut short as if swallowed. That night he spread the letters and maps across the table and added his own notes, penciled margins filling with questions and dates. He called numbers listed in fine print and left messages that were never returned. When sleep finally came, it brought images of fences rising overnight, of water drained away until the land cracked and whitened under sun. The next day, a man in a pressed shirt arrived unannounced, shoes unsuited to mud. He introduced himself with a smile that never reached his eyes and spoke of opportunities. Compensation. Relocation. The horses were a complication, he said gently, a liability no one needed. The rancher listened, arms folded, noticing how the man avoided looking toward the swamp. When the offer was declined, the smile thinned, hardened, and the conversation ended as abruptly as it had begun. Pressure followed. Survey crews appeared at the edges of the property, polite but persistent, recording measurements that ignored his presence. Notices were posted, then reposted when removed. The neighbor who had warned him earlier stopped waving when they passed on the road. Silence became a tool wielded by many hands. He sought allies where he could find them. An elderly woman who had lived nearby her entire life told him of horses that once roamed open pasture before drainage projects hemmed them in. A retired surveyor admitted, after long hesitation, that maps could be made to say whatever paid best. Each fragment added weight to his growing sense that this conflict had been rehearsed before, its outcome usually decided long before anyone noticed. The foal's limp worsened. He watched it struggle to rise one morning, legs splaying before finding balance. He felt the pull to act, stronger now, sharpened by urgency. He contacted a veterinarian who listened carefully, then declined, citing jurisdiction and permits. Even compassion, it seemed, required authorization. Storm clouds gathered one afternoon, darkening the sky with theatrical speed. Thunder rolled across the swamp, echoing like distant machinery. As rain fell, he stood beneath the awning and watched the horses bunch together, their silhouettes blurred by sheets of water. The land absorbed the storm easily, swelling but not breaking, as if it had been preparing for this all along. When the rain eased, he found a notice nailed to a tree near the clearing. Removal order. Deadline specified. Consequences outlined in careful legal language that left no room for misunderstanding. He read it once, then again, feeling the shift inside him as something passive hardened into resolve. The swamp was quiet around him, the horses barely visible through mist, waiting in the only way they knew. He folded the paper slowly and looked out over the land that had chosen him as much as he had chosen it, understanding that whatever came next would no longer be decided in private. He walked back to the truck and rested his hands on the hood, feeling the engine's residual warmth fade beneath his palms. The decision ahead was narrowing, stripping away comfortable illusions. He could sell, sign, and vanish again, lighter by money and heavier by knowing. Or he could stay, invite scrutiny, and test whether patience could stand against organized certainty. The swamp offered no advice, only presence, its water reflecting a sky that promised neither mercy nor retreat. Yet, so. He did not answer the removal notice. Instead, he pinned it above the table where maps and letters lay layered like sediment, evidence of pressure accumulating over weeks. Each morning he rose before dawn and walked the swamp, checking the horses, counting them, memorizing their shapes against the light. The missing horse did not return. The foal still limped. Nothing about the situation improved, yet something in him steadied as if clarity had replaced hope. The hearing was scheduled in a county building that smelled of disinfectant and old paper. He arrived early, boots cleaned but still unmistakably worn, and took a seat on a hard bench beneath a flickering light. Across the room, representatives from the development firm spoke in low, confident tones, papers aligned, expressions composed. They nodded politely when they saw him, the way people do when they believe an outcome is inevitable. When the session began, there were no speeches. Only questions. The officials asked about land use, compliance, timelines. The firm's attorney spoke smoothly about economic benefits and legal precedent, about mitigation plans that reduced living creatures to figures in a report. When it was his turn, he stood slowly and answered only what was asked. He described the water levels after storms. He described the horses' presence, their behavior, their dependence on the wetland. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He let the details carry their own weight. A pause settled over the room when an environmental officer requested additional documentation. The maps slid across the table again, but this time they were accompanied by older surveys, yellowed and fragile, their ink uneven. A former surveyor, hands shaking slightly, confirmed discrepancies without embellishment. The firm's attorney objected. The objection was noted. The pause deepened. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping softly against narrow windows. The sound seemed to slow everything, drawing attention away from rhetoric and toward consequence. The officials conferred quietly. No one smiled. No one looked at him directly. He waited, hands folded, remembering how patience had once been his most reliable tool. The ruling was not dramatic. It arrived in careful language, provisional but firm. The wetland classification would be reviewed. All removal actions were suspended pending assessment. The horses would remain for now. The firm's representatives gathered their papers with practiced restraint, the confidence in their movements altered, just enough to notice. He left the building into rain that felt clean and purposeful. The parking lot shimmered, reflecting the sky in broken pieces. He did not feel victorious. Relief moved through him more quietly, like water seeping back into ground that had been dry too long. There was still work ahead. Reviews could be delayed. Decisions reversed. But the momentum had shifted, if only slightly. Back at the swamp, the horses stood where they always had, rain-darkened coats blending into the landscape. He approached without haste. The mare watched him closely, then lowered her head. The foal stepped forward, placing weight on the bad leg and holding it, just a moment longer than before. He noticed. He always noticed. Weeks passed measured by small changes. Officials returned, this time with notebooks rather than notices. Biologists walked the land slowly, pointing out plants that thrived only in saturated soil, insects that depended on standing water. Each observation layered protection over the place, transforming what had been dismissed into something documented, defensible. The firm withdrew quietly, its interest redirected elsewhere, leaving behind stakes pulled free and tracks erased by weather. No announcement marked their departure. The swamp absorbed the absence as it had absorbed everything else. He repaired fences not to confine but to guide, channels that kept vehicles out and animals safe. A veterinarian arrived at last, permitted now, and treated the foal's leg with gentle efficiency. Healing was not immediate, but it was possible, which felt like enough. One evening, months later, he stood at the edge of the clearing as the sun slipped low, turning water to copper. The horses grazed unhurried, their movements easy. The land breathed around them, alive and unafraid. He thought of the day he had arrived, expecting nothing, prepared to vanish. Instead, he had been seen, pressed into relevance by circumstance and choice. He did not claim the swamp had changed him completely. He still carried loss. He still woke early listening. But he had learned that staying, when leaving would be simpler, could redraw a future as surely as any map. As darkness gathered and the first stars appeared, he felt the quiet satisfaction of a line held, not through force but through attention and refusal. The swamp reflected the night without distortion, and in that still surface the story settled, complete yet ongoing, waiting for whoever might stand there next and listen. In the days that followed, letters arrived again, but their tone had changed, language softened by uncertainty. Some asked questions rather than issuing demands. Others thanked him for cooperation he had not offered but somehow provided. He read them all, then filed them away, understanding that paper trails mattered as much as footprints now. Visitors came, cautiously curious, journalists with notebooks and activists with careful eyes. He spoke little, pointing instead to water lines on tree trunks, to hoofprints preserved in drying mud, to life continuing without spectacle. At night, he sat outside and listened to the horses move, the sound grounding him more effectively than any promise. The swamp no longer felt like a place borrowed from failure but one earned through endurance. Each morning brought familiar labor, each evening a measure of peace. He knew challenges would return, that attention never truly disappears once drawn. Still, he had learned how to stand within it, rooted and unyielding, not heroic, just present. That, he realized, was often enough. The horses lifted their heads together, as if sensing the moment, and the swamp answered with quiet certainty, holding them all in a balance that felt, finally, like justice earned and nothing more needed to be proven.